Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of Rochester's Rich History. I'm Brandon Fess with the Local History and Genealogy Division, the Rochester Public Library. Today's presentation is on the new book, The Untold Story of Shields Green, by Louis DeCaro Jr. Shields Green was a freedom seeker, a friend of Frederick Douglass, sometime resident of Rochester, New York, and one of those who sacrificed his life with John Brown at Harper's Ferry. Largely forgotten to history, he's been brought back to us, his story revived in Professor DeCaro's recent book. By means of introduction, Louis A. DeCaro Jr. holds graduate degrees in theology and history from Westminster Theological Seminary and New York University, and a PhD from New York University. He's an ordained clergyman and has served in a number of churches in the greater New York City area, but has also been professor of history and theology at Alliance Theological Seminary in New York City for over a decade. As a biographer, Louis published 2 books about the religious aspects of the human rights activist Malcolm X, most notably On the Side of My People, A Religious Life of Malcolm X. For over 2 decades, Lou has devoted in-depth study to the life and letters of abolitionist John Brown. His first book on Brown, Fire from the Midst of You, A Religious Life of John Brown, continued his interest in religious biography. This was followed by a smaller but substantive work, John Brown, The Cost of Freedom, which challenges the many errors and mistaken notions that burden Brown's popular reputation. In 2015, 2 complementary works were published, Freedom's Dawn, The Last Days of John Brown in Virginia, and John Brown Speaks, Letters and Statements from Charlestown, the first detailed narrative of the abolitionist's last days since his hanging in 1859. Lou has contributed articles in a number of other works relating to Malcolm X, John Brown, and abolition. His latest work, The Untold Story of Shields Green, The Life and Death of a Harper's Ferry Raider, New York University Press, 2020, reveals a unique and challenging effort to rediscover a figure that has been obscured within the conventional history of the struggle for justice in the United States. Lou is married to Michelle Switting DeCaro, an educator and gospel vocalist. Their son, Louis Michael, is 14 years old and aspires to be a civil court judge. Without further ado, Professor Louis DeCaro Jr.
Thank you, Brandon. I appreciate the kind welcome to Rochester, if only virtually. And thank you, Brandon, for all that you've done. And also, I think Christine Radarski, who helped me set up with the Zoom. But it's good to be with you, and I thank you for the invitation. I actually lived in Rochester for about a year back in the early 80s, and I loved the city. I now have been living in Manhattan, living in the New York City area and in Manhattan now for a good many years. As a matter of fact, where I live on Cathedral Parkway, which runs on the west side of Manhattan, if there is some traffic sounds, I have a problem with that because I live on a this main thoroughfare. So please forgive me. I hate to have to mute myself because I have to speak. So it's an awkward situation, but I'm glad to be with you. And I'm happy to be able to come, as all authors are, to talk about their books, but it's special to be asked to speak to a Rochester audience because obviously you know the great historical value of the ground upon which you walk and the city in which you live. It's precious to the story of the abolition movement and certainly even the John Brown story. So let me just start with some preliminary comments about John Brown or thoughts about John Brown, and then I'll share about the Shields Green book, both talking about Shields Green, the work itself, and then what I came up with and what I tentatively, at this point, committed to in terms of his story. So John Brown is an important figure. The late Larry Lawrence was a friend of mine who was the founder of the John Brown Society here in New York City. He used to say that John Brown was kind of the cow in the middle of the road when it came to the history of the United States and slavery. John Brown came at a time when he was, when the country was really at an impasse. Of course, he, like all people, developed in his younger days. He was born in 1800 and he was hanged in 1859. So the arc of his life is fairly well the arc of the antebellum era itself. And of course, his own death punctuates the end of the antebellum era in a particular way. And what we know about Brown's life is that he started as from the time, almost perhaps from the time of being an infant, he was immersed in an anti-slavery family context. But he embraced that anti-slavery passion himself at the age of 12. His own story is that he witnessed a young Black male being abused, a young man that who had befriended him. He saw him being abused, whether or not he was actually a slave or whether he was enslaved circumstantially in the Northwest Territories, another question. But I don't think there's any reason to doubt that he was traumatized by what he saw, and that given that his father and family were both very devout Christians, they were in the Reformed tradition, the Congregational tradition, and that he was reared to hate slavery, plus his own experience of seeing this made him devoted. He said later that he worked the Underground Railroad from the time he was a boy. He always had different ideas he was looking for ways to try to ameliorate the situation. He was more conservative in his younger days, apropos of the period, the 1820s and 1830s. There probably wasn't the same sensibility about what was going to happen with slavery. There was probably more of an optimism that slavery would be somehow overruled or ruled out. And in his 30s, he thought about starting schools for young Black people. He thought about obtaining enslaved people and helping them to start, but he wasn't radicalized yet. And he didn't actually become radicalized until the 1840s, when he lived in Springfield, Massachusetts, when he interacted, I think, much more personally within the Black community. And he also saw the direction that the country was going by the late 1840s. Of course, you'll remember that by 1850, we had the renewed Fugitive Slave Act. There was a Fugitive Slave Act on the record, but the one that was passed in 1850 really put teeth into slavery. It essentially demanded that people who were fleeing from slavery, those who escaped from slavery, had to be returned by law-abiding citizens, by whites. So it not only intensified the racialized nature of this systemic oppression of slavery, but it essentially stacked the deck in favor of slaveholders and essentially said that no matter where a Black person who was escaping from slavery went, they were subject to the whims of the slaveholding powers, and the pressure was on them. So that was 1850. 1857 was the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott fairly well sealed it, because you may recall Dred Scott was an enslaved man who was brought north by the master, and the abolitionist community tried to use him as a kind of a test case. And, in a way that, in the same way that Rosa Parks was used, how she volunteered to challenge the segregation system. The idea was to see if they could find a legal basis to say that if an enslaved person is brought north, that they can be freed. And of course, the Supreme Court ruled to the opposite. And the infamous words of Chief Justice Roger Taney was that a Black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. That fairly well sealed things. So by 1858, if you can picture right there in your hometown where Frederick Douglass is living, who had been living there for quite a while, who had made a big impact on the Rochester community, had become a kind of lighthouse for enslaved people, had attracted enslaved people to his door, but also, I think in Douglass's own claims, that he himself had made a big impact on the whites in Rochester. He'd helped to kind of bring them closer to a humanitarian perspective and evoke the sympathies of good people, or the better angels of, to use Lincoln's words, the better angels of people's nature, to create in Rochester a more friendly atmosphere. I think Douglass kind of claimed that that was his own impact, and I don't have any reason to question that, given the pervasiveness in the North of racism. We often have this idea that slavery as a Southern institution meant racism was in the South and that the North was a free place. But the reality is racism permeated the country. We still are struggling with racism, but in the antebellum era, there was explicit, unbridled racism in the North. There's a book that was written half a century ago, still a valuable book, North of Slavery by Leon Litwack. And so check that book out because it discusses the circumstances of even free Black people in the North and how hard it was. So Douglass is in Rochester. And in 1858, he has a house guest. That house guest is John Brown. And John Brown is sequestered in a bedroom in the Douglass household, working on a constitution for a dissenting, you might call it a guerrilla state that he wanted to found. But Brown and Douglass are together for this period of time, and he sort of drives Douglass a little crazy because Brown is very much fixated on this plan and purpose, and he's talking about it with Douglass until Douglass says, he's himself. And imagine Douglass, of all people, who gives his life to speak against slavery and is constantly engaged in the struggle for justice. Even he finds Brown a bit overbearing, and because Brown was a very single-minded man, and I'll talk about his character in a moment. But there's an interesting letter from January of 1858 in which Brown writes to his family who are living in the Adirondacks. He said, "I'm in New York State again. I have been on the run. I haven't been home in a long time. I'm here in New York State." But he's not really going to get a chance to see them because he's so busy trying to plan for the Harper's Ferry raid, which he wanted to do in 1858, but which got foiled, and then he ended up doing in 1859. But he's with Douglass, and he writes to his wife, and he's sending personal greetings. He's engaging his family, and then Frederick Douglass writes a postscript in this letter to Mary Brown, to John Brown's wife, saying, we're happy to entertain him. You're welcome. It might be safer for you to come here to Rochester, maybe if you want to see your husband, something she didn't do. It would have been a hard trip for her to make from the Adirondacks down to Rochester. But more importantly, he expresses this personal sense of familiarity with the friendship. And what I found in my work, I've been doing John Brown work now for 20 years, is that there was a close personal familial tie between the Browns and the Douglasses. As a matter of fact, one of the Browns' children remembered that even at times the Browns did some babysitting for the Douglass children. I don't know what the circumstances were, but there was also a close attachment. One of Frederick Douglass's daughters, who was young, had a strong affection for John Brown. And so there's a very personal story to the anti-slavery movement, to the abolition movement. And that personal story is really what historians also want to appreciate. We want to understand the political and social circumstances, but we also are interested very much in the personal stories and the lives of people. And of course, if we don't have all the information, we have a lot of information on John Brown. And of course, that's been the substance of my work, as I said, for a couple of decades now. Not a lot about this young African-American freedom fighter, Shields Green, who most recently I have had the honor of trying to rediscover. But again, before I do, John Brown was 59 years old when he was hanged in Virginia in 1859. And he is, as I said, impossible to get around if you want to talk about the Civil War, if you want to talk about Lincoln, if you want to talk about slavery, it's sooner or later you got to come to John Brown. In fact, I was a little disappointed that CNN is running this series on Lincoln, and it's very interesting. And it's a good series. There's a lot to be said for it, pros and cons. But it's very interesting that they skipped over the whole John Brown episode. They mentioned the Kansas episode of the 1850s, and then they went with Lincoln into that period of time. the reality is you can't skip around John Brown because John Brown makes an impact that even Lincoln himself could not avoid. He had to talk about it. But why is John Brown so important? Well, John Brown is important for a number of reasons. Number one, he is kind of the controversial figure. I often say that he is the Black community's ally, and he has functioned, unfortunately, as the white community's boogeyman. He need not be, because in fact, a lot of what we have come to know about John Brown or believe about John Brown, we have to remember, was itself the product of where we've been as a country for the past 100 years. So there have been historical distortions, and there are flawed assumptions that have remained largely in the public thinking. And when I say that, I'm also meaning largely the white community, the larger white community. Interestingly, many Black people historically over time have come to think of John Brown, assuming John Brown was a Black man. But of course, he was a European, of European extraction. He was of English and some Dutch extraction. His family having some connection to the Puritans, and he himself being born in Connecticut, and then his family moving to Ohio's Western Reserve, northeastern Ohio, in 1805, where he grew up in, as I said, a strong anti-slavery family in a community that was largely made up of anti-slavery people in Hudson, Ohio. And in Hudson, Ohio was a stop on the Underground Railroad before it was even called the Underground Railroad. I was had a very interesting conversation with Brandon, who is a historian and a railroad expert. And so now I've got a source to talk to somebody. But it wasn't even called the Underground Railroad because it had to be named after something. And Brown was involved in this kind of support of those who were fleeing from slavery even before the Overground Railroad existed. So Brown called it the subterranean passageway, which may give us a hint into how it was referred to before there was a railroad. So as I mentioned, by the 1850s, there's a radicalization going on in the North, and there's a siren, and so I apologize for that. I happen to live near a hospital, so I get this a lot. Is there some way I can make this the dramatic garnish on the? No, I can't. Okay, so there it goes. John Brown is part of a larger scenario where anti-slavery people in the 1850s are moving from a kind of a belief that slavery could be ended by what was called moral suasion, by preaching, a lot of Bible-based preaching, and the idea that the hearts of slaveholders could be changed. Not unlike, there's echoes of this in the Southern Civil Rights Movement with Dr. King's pacifist approach. The idea that, we are going to overcome slavery through nonviolence. Well, that was largely the definition of the anti-slavery movement from the 1820s, the 30s, into the 40s. But after, as I mentioned, the laws about fugitive slaves, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the Supreme Court decision of 1857, the Dred Scott, there was a militant attitude, a political abolitionism that began to rise. And Brown is part of that too. Brown does away with belief in an absolute commitment to pacifism. Now, he never becomes a man who believes in violence, and he doesn't violence in the sense that violence itself is, we're going to actually do an overturning of society. I argue, and I've been studying Brown now for quite a while, I don't believe that he was a revolutionary, not in the strict sense of overturning society. Brown actually wanted to evacuate slavery from the national, from the body politic. He believed in U.S. society. He did not want to undermine or overturn the United States government. He simply wanted to excise slavery as if it were a bad disease from the body of the country. I'd say he was more of a radical reformer, and he moved in that direction, recognizing that slaveholders were not going to give up slavery because it was profitable and because it had become so much a part of their own worldview. These people actually believed not only that Black people were inferior, but Black people were best their property to be supervised by them. So the high end of the slavery argument was that, these are people that are helpless, and it's our Christian duty to help them. That was the upside. The downside, of course, was the brutality, exploitation, the terror, the stolen labor, all the things that characterize slavery in this country. And unlike slavery, because you can look at slavery throughout world history in many different cultures, but I would argue that slavery in the United States was perhaps the worst manifestation of slavery in the history of the world for two reasons. The first is that it was an absolutely dehumanizing, racist institution, and that there were only few exceptions where an enslaved person, a Black person who was living under slavery, could in any sense rise to any position. Now, there were exceptions here and there, but the norm overwhelmingly is that people are dehumanized. Families are destroyed. It isn't simply that labor is taken, that the profits of labor are taken, but that families are destroyed, people are dehumanized. Now that's, I think, and the amount of violence and terror or threat of violence that is used to sustain this system is absolute. That's the first thing. The second thing is that unlike earlier forms of slavery, this is the most hypocritical form of slavery because it is carried out by people who purport themselves to be Christians and who have an ethos to draw upon that the Romans didn't have to draw on. Roman slavery could be both barbaric, but it could also have exceptions, plenty of exceptions. Greek slavery. Slavery in Africa would have been a very different kind of a thing. Slavery in the so-called Christian West was at the height of hypocrisy because Christianity in the ancient and medieval world had at least come to the place where you could not enslave a fellow Christian. Slavery was effectively really, it had become, shall we say, destabilized, and it had begun to wane in the medieval period because Christians understood that you couldn't hold another Christian as a slave. So the long-term effects of St. Paul's teachings about if you can, if you're a slave and you can get your freedom, get it. Masters, if you have a brother or a sister who's a slave, you got to treat them like a brother or sister. All this kind of deep, kind of work that is planted, kind of like a deep explosive that is going to have rippling effects, began to change Western culture in terms of slavery. But the slaveholding Spaniards and the slaveholding British of the early modern period turned all that around in the worst way. And so by the time you get to the 19th century, you have a form of Christianized slavery that would make St. Paul turn over in his grave, if you will. That certainly raised serious questions about the Christian ethic and bifurcated or created two kinds of Christianities, a Christianity of the enslaved and the Christianity of the oppressor. And it is the Christianity of the oppressor that John Brown is important as a counterpoint. Because people say, well, that's the way people thought in those days. No, it's not. You can't excuse slavery in the past because you have to talk about the fact that there were people, there were white men and women, many of them very devout in their religion, as devout as were the most devout of the pious Southern slaveholders, be they Presbyterians or Methodists, men and women like John and Mary Brown, who were devout Christians and who saw the blasphemy of framing a human being in racial and politically oppressive terms. John Brown believed slavery was a form of war waged by one people upon another. And he came to believe that given the entrenchment of slavery, that by the late 1850s, there was no political way to look for emancipation to come. And history proved that. And as much as Lincoln did not want to associate the Republican Party with John Brown after the Harper's Ferry raid, as much as he worked so hard to deny that, at the end of the day, even Lincoln had to turn the Civil War into an anti-slavery cause, because slavery literally could not be defeated without violence and bloodshed. And when John Brown was hanged in 1859, his last written words were, "I had vainly hoped that I might accomplish the undermining of slavery with very little bloodshed. But I see now that I was mistaken." And it took a civil war to end slavery. This gives us the idea about how deeply entrenched slavery was into this country. And let's not demonize the South entirely, because the reality is the North was profiting from the slave trade and from the practice of the slave trade, the operations of slavery. It was cities like New York, where I live, especially, where insurance and manufacturing and all the byproducts and the wealth of slavery were enriching New York and in the North, in many of the manufacturing centers of the North and the business centers of the North. Slavery was a U.S. institution. It was in the Constitution. It had to be struck down, but it took a war before that could be accomplished. So John Brown is important because he sees, along with other abolitionists, not the only one, but he sees that slavery is a problem. But he is also, in the 1850s, the only one who tries to do something about it. Where there is no possibility of the ending of slavery, he tries to launch a plan to end slavery. What is that plan? Often, we tend to get our information about the plan of John Brown had from the standpoint of the Southern reportage, which became entrenched in the Congressional Report of 1860, which was itself supervised by a pro-slavery Virginia senator, James Mason, and it's often called the Mason Report. The reality is, this is what John Brown wanted to do. He had two phases. The first phase he shared with Frederick Douglass, and Douglass supported it, by the way, and that was, he wanted to enter into the South, and he wanted to begin to lead enslaved people away, arm them, break them into small cadres, and work their way through the vast mountain system that actually starts up north and works its way down deep into the South and the Appalachian system. He wanted to follow that, and he wanted to draw men and women, arm them, and he wanted to continue to lead enslaved people from one county, from one state into the South, to destabilize slavery. And we can document this from things that he said, from what his son said, that his purpose was to, as it were, destabilize the daily operations of slavery. He wanted slavery as a machine to break down. He wanted to do that by creating ways in which people could, large numbers could run away, be armed, be protected, join a community of resistance in the mountains, perhaps running some people north, but largely simply to grow this massive number of people that were not an army marching. So let me point out, he was not an insurrectionist. An insurrectionist is an advocate of servile war, like Spartacus was with the Romans. John Brown did not want to launch an insurrection. He did not want to kill slaveholders and their families. He wanted to destabilize and destroy the operations, the stability of slavery. He wanted to destroy the money value of slavery, because once you begin to destabilize slavery and people are running away, slaveholders will respond. If they can't fight you, as they could with Nat Turner, for instance, in 1831 in Virginia, then they're going to start selling their property further south to try to save the money value. And this is exactly what Brown wanted to do. He wanted to create a kind of a rippling effect or a domino effect of destabilization, and he wanted to throw slavery completely off kilter. A kind of, the idea of, the Dutch throwing their shoe into the manufacturing devices as a way of sabotage, right? Of the Nazis' occupation. He wanted to do that to slavery. And he hoped that he could this way destabilize it, weaken it, even bring slavery to an end. And then at whatever political operations came out of that, we would see slavery brought to a standstill, and that many people would be free. That was his hope, but he never got to it. He never was able to carry that out because he got stuck at Harper's Ferry. Why did he choose Harper's Ferry? I want to get to Shields Green, so I just want to set this up. He chose Harper's Ferry because he had we have a letter from in 1840 where he was actually, he had surveyed, he had traveled through Western Virginia. He knew much about the states, and he picked Harper's Ferry as geographically as a kind of entrance into the South. But while he was in Kansas in the 1850s, and that's a whole other story, fighting, pro-slavery terrorists, which is what they were, invading Kansas and trying to destabilize democracy there. Well, during that time, in 1856, a group of Southerners raided a federal arsenal in Missouri and took the weapons and used them to attack Free State people in Kansas in 1856. John Brown suggests that although he had the plan for doing something in the South going back to 1840, if not earlier, he decided to attack the armory at Harper's Ferry because of this incident, I believe. I'm connecting the dots. Something big happened in 1856, and that's when he says, I started thinking about this in 1856. I believe it was this raid on the federal arsenal in Missouri by pro-slavery people. And it was never prosecuted. It never was a point that the government pursued. And this is because the government at that time, with I think it was President Taylor and then going into Buchanan, were pro-slavery, or at least were dough faces, as the expression went, that they were Democrats who were, technically not for slavery, but they were not going to support any anti-slavery effort. They were pro-South for economic and political reasons. And so Brown thought, I'm going to make a demonstration. Before I start my movement, I'm going to seize the armory. Now, one of the things that's often said, and you've probably heard it a million times, is that he seized the armory to steal the weapons. Well, I would like to submit to you that that's a complete invention of the Southerners. The fact of the matter is this: he never planned to take the weapons. He denied after that he had any intention and interest in the weapons. This is all in the journalism and in interviews taken. He made no preparation to remove the weapons. No weapons were removed during the whole time he occupied Harper's Ferry in October of 1859. And as a matter of fact, he posted guards at the arsenal, which is where the weapons were, so that there were no weapons removed. And he told two different journalists, New York Times and New York Daily Tribune, he said, I brought my own weapons. I had better weapons, because he had Sharps repeating rifles. The rifles that were produced at Harper's Ferry were breech loading rifles. And he didn't take them. So there were no rifles removed. He didn't even have the wagons to carry them off. So this notion that he seized the armory to take the weapons is a myth. And I know where it comes from. It comes from Southern slaveholders. It comes from the Mason Report. He made the tactical error of staying in Harper's Ferry too long, and thus he was captured. And one of the people captured with him was a young African-American man, a young Black man by the name of Shields Green. I'd be happy to address the issue of Kansas, but I won't do it here now, because again, this is another issue of the Potawatomi so-called massacre, and I have my own thoughts on that as well. But perhaps if you want to raise that afterward, we can do that, but I'm not going to address that here. I'd like to talk about Shields Green because, first of all, give me the backstory. Why did I ended up writing a book on Shields Green? For as long as I've been doing John Brown work, I haven't really been as interested in the Harper's Ferry Raiders as other people have. There have been a number of authors who have written about the Harper's Ferry Raiders in general. That's been something that's been slow to grow of interest to me. In fairness, I'd say it's a good thing that it has, because many times the Harpers Ferry Raiders have been, disappeared, as it were, because it's all been about John Brown. But the reality is he had this group of largely young men, this interracial army, if you will, with 5 Black men who joined, along with these various group of white men who supported him. And the Black community, of course, has always had an interest from the time of Frederick Douglass in the Black Raiders. And the Black Raiders, of course, were always shortchanged in historical record. So very as little as there has been written and published about John Brown's Raiders, initially, most of the attention was paid to the white Raiders. And although there were significant figures and they ought to be known, the Black Raiders were much more kind of set aside. Even in their arrest, even in their story, they are segregated. So what happened for me was I started getting interested in Shields Green when, interestingly, it was announced that a movie was being made about Shields Green. A movie that actually came out, with COVID, it came out as something to watch on cable. But that movie got me interested. And I thought, well, let me do a little article of some kind about the history behind Shields Green. I thought that I knew a little about Shields Green. And so I went back and I started calling my sources and doing research and seeing what I could come up with. And as I did, I started to see a couple of things that made me begin to think differently. Like I needed to get more into this because the other Raiders were a little bit, were better known. There were 2 gentlemen who came from Oberlin, Ohio, and they were much better known. As a matter of fact, an associate, a friend, colleague, Stephen Lubet, has written about John Anthony Copeland. And another book was recently written about the 5 Black Raiders. But Shields Green is the least known. And kind of the symbol of that would be in the fact that we don't even have a daguerreotype photograph of him. That's kind of symbolic of the fact that every one of the Harpers Ferry Raiders, from John Brown down to the last man, we have an early photographic image of them, except for Shields Green. And that, again, that's a kind of a metaphor for the fact that we know very little about the man. And so I thought, let me try to explore some of these leads. And so I began to try to do some research. One of the things I had to try to do was try to do some research in South Carolina, in Charleston, where he came from. So the traditional story of Shields Green is this, that Shields Green was a young man, perhaps in his 20s, that he had run away from slavery, that he was a slave in South Carolina, that he left behind a young child, a young son, that he was widowed when he ran away, that he came north and came to Rochester, New York. And there he was befriended by Frederick Douglass. And then through Frederick Douglass, he was introduced to John Brown. And then he joined John Brown, perhaps in the hope of liberating his young son left behind in South Carolina. And unfortunately, he went to Harper's Ferry and unfortunately fell prey to the circumstances of failure as a result of John Brown's tactical delays. And then, of course, he chose to stay with Brown, and he stayed with Brown, took a stand with him at the very last moments. He was captured, and then he was hanged, following John Brown's hanging in December of 1859. That's the conventional story. And the reality is historians don't know a lot about him other than that. And there was a kind of narrative of Shields Green that was passed down. And it begins, interestingly enough, with Frederick Douglass. And one of the things I found was that Frederick Douglass, who essentially introduced him or was the means by which Green was introduced to John Brown in early 1859, I think in April of 1859, that he paid tribute to him. And in telling the story of Shields Green, he created the myth that in the very last moments, Shields Green chose to stay with John Brown. Now, we know that Shields Green did choose to join John Brown against the better judgments of Frederick Douglass. But this last part, that Shields Green chose to stay with John Brown in the Harper's Ferry engine house, actually, as I've come to the conclusion, is a fabrication of Frederick Douglass. According to Osborne Anderson, the Black Harper's Ferry raider who escaped and who wrote a short narrative, which I think has been grossly ignored or has been dismissed by white scholars for reasons that I think are really trivial and the work needs to be considered. According to Osborne Anderson, Shields Green died with John Brown because he misunderstood the directions. And when it was time to escape, he went into the engine house to be with Brown, as opposed to getting away with the few that were able to escape. Osborne Anderson himself, one of the Black raiders, was able to use the Underground Railroad, and in that way, with the support of those on the Underground Railroad, he was able to make it back north and then back to Chatham, Ontario, where he lived. So the sad fact is that Shields Green, was captured and he was hanged. So what about this young man? First of all, was he a man in his 20s? I found that Shields Green most likely was a man in his 30s, perhaps 35. Shields Green also came from Charleston, South Carolina. But Shields Green made the statement to at least one journalist, particularly one journalist who visited the prisoners after they were convicted in November of 1859, and they were jailed in Charlestown, Virginia, which today is Charlestown, 2 words, West Virginia. And this journalist who wrote about it said Shields Green said that he was actually born of free parents. I'm taking that seriously. And now some people will doubt that and will say that he would have said he was free anyway, but I don't think that he would have said he was born free after the fact. He would have said that before his trial, and it wouldn't have made any difference anyway. And as far as the New York Herald reports, that they really couldn't determine his status. So I don't put much store in that. I put more store in the fact that Shields Green would tell a journalist after the fact that his parents were free. So he was born of, I'm assuming he's born of free parents, and he lives in that peculiar status as a free Black person in the Lower South. And of course, work has been done on this, and more work needs to be appreciated about the presence of free Blacks in the Deep South. It was a very hard existence. And it particularly would have been harder because of the racist colorization, the emphasis on the darker the person, the more benighted they were in the view of Southern society, in the view of Northern society. Even in the trial, there was a greater sympathy for John Anthony Copeland, a Black man from Oberlin, Ohio, because he was, quote, a mulatto. He was a light-skinned Black man. He was viewed with a measure of sympathy. None of that was given to Shields Green. And this is very clear in the newspaper reportage. As little as there is, that Green's color as a man with rich melanin, that he is viewed as in terrible terms, as somebody who's inferior. He's the negative. He's objectified in sheer racism because of his color. And as a free Black man, he would have been even a minority among free people of color in the South who tended to be lighter. Now, we don't know why he fled, the circumstances. We do know that according to the record we have from Anne Brown Adams, the daughter of John Brown, we do know that he had been married. We do know that he escaped and he came to New York City by way of a sailboat or some kind of a trading boat that came from Charleston Harbor and probably in New York Harbor on the way maybe to Boston. Whatever the case is, he escaped. My assumption is, of course, I don't assume he escaped from slavery because, again, this has been the assumption. I think that, in fact, there were probably a number of reasons. He may have escaped because he was in danger of being enslaved, because the condition of free Black people was they were in between two worlds. They were dehumanized, degraded. They were victims of racist oppression, but they were technically free, but they were subjected to the whims and the overpowering interests of the white society. But they were not enslaved either, but they could be reduced to slavery or virtual slavery for economic reasons, for legal reasons. And so if Greene was himself in danger of being reduced to slavery, he chose to run away. Now, it's also possible that he tried to slip out with the intention of not being noticed so that he could slip back in later on to get his son. But he did flee. He was a widower, but I have not been able to determine his wife's name. I can't even find to this point now. Others have seemingly found something about it. One genealogical researcher who registered some information in the Mormon library, in the Mormon collection, which is, of course, a vast resource for genealogy, dated his birth, would have made him about 35 years old at the time of his death. But maybe that person was able to find him. They registered him also under the name of Shields Greene. Some people have claimed he had a different name, but I find no evidence to support that he was actually named anything other than Shields Greene. So he's Shields Greene. He's very likely a free-born man. He flees South Carolina, perhaps because he's in trouble with the law. Perhaps he can't make certain payments because Black men could both be beaten and imprisoned, even over petty fees and tax issues and all these kinds of things. He flees. He comes north. He's perhaps smuggled on a boat, very likely smuggled. He may have been thrown into the Charleston jail, where he may have met sailors, or he may have made some other arrangement. But he gets to New York, and then in New York, he ends up in Rochester. But what I found was that Greene also had made claims that he had participated in anti-slavery resistance in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. This got my attention. So I started to try to find some research. And there are a number of references in interviews with him as a prisoner that refer him to other parts of Pennsylvania. But I concluded that it was probably Harrisburg. That seems to be the best references. And Harrisburg had anti-slavery kind of resistance. You might call them riots, or you might call them, resistance episodes in 1850. And so in 1850, that he would have to have been in his 30s in order to have escaped. That would suggest then that he escaped much earlier. So he didn't just escape. And like this movie that's called Emperor shows him, he's on his way north by land, which of course didn't happen. And then he meets John Brown before he even gets to New York. He never gets to Rochester in that movie. But of course, he very likely may have come from New York. He may have gone through Philadelphia. There is one somewhat unreliable source that says he had connections in Philadelphia. There was a direct connection between Philadelphia and Harrisburg in terms of the Black community. I would argue that he went into Harrisburg, that he was there for a while. There was a thriving, flourishing Black community in Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania. It was comprised of both free people and those who have escaped from slavery. And then he ended up going to Rochester. And we know that he was in Rochester prior, probably around 1856, 1857. There was an article that appeared in a Rochester paper. It was also reprinted in the New York Daily Tribune. And it stated that he was living in Rochester. Then he went to Canada. We don't know where he went to Canada. He went to Ontario, Canada, and was in Canada, worked there for a while, maybe for a couple of years, and came back to Rochester. And it was after he returned to Rochester that he was introduced to John Brown by Frederick Douglass. So we don't really know the extent of his relationship. It could very well be that Greene, when he left Harrisburg, he came and he stayed with Douglass like others had in his home, but he ended up moving on to Canada and he stayed there and worked there for a while. Then he came back. The question is why he came back to Rochester, because the flow by that time, remember, after the Fugitive Slave Act, and by the way, if you're a Black person in the North, you could be kidnapped. We know that, whether or not you actually were enslaved in the South. If you were Black, you could be kidnapped and taken. So that probably would be the reason why Greene ended up going to Canada. The question is, why does he come back? And my suggestion is that John Brown had canvassed free escaped or repatriated Black people in Canada West, as it was called in those days. He had actually traveled from the area close to Rochester all the way across Canada West to as far as Chatham, which is across from Detroit, Michigan. And in that whole process, even with the seeking out the assistance of Harriet Tubman, he was looking to enlist Black men for his cause. And my suggestion is that what brought Shields Greene back to Rochester was in fact John Brown. I don't have any suggestion that or evidence that he actually met Brown in Canada. Very likely he missed him or Brown missed him. But very likely his decision to come to Rochester was he wanted to be connected with Brown and he sought out Douglass. Now, I believe that this was the case also because it's very clear that by 1859, that Douglass does not want to support John Brown's plan. The reason being is John Brown had added the Harper's Ferry armory portion to his plan. So what John Brown did, again, as I mentioned earlier, was he had this long-term plan to go into the South, which Douglass supported. So anyone who says that Douglass did not support Brown's plan, it's not the case. What Douglass objected to was John Brown's intention of seizing the armory. And it was, in the words of a New York Daily Tribune journalist who interviewed Brown, referred to this as John Brown staging a kind of grand demonstration. Douglass did not approve of that. Now, we have the autobiography of Frederick Douglass written late in his life. But the reality is the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, like all autobiography, engages in conflation. Douglass does not talk about the fact that John Brown first spoke to him in March of 1859 in Detroit, and then came to see him in April of 1859. And they had some words and they had a little bit of a falling out because Douglass did not want to support Brown in terms of seizing the Harper's Ferry armory. I'm not suggesting Douglass didn't tell the truth. I'm suggesting that he tended to put this entire episode into one frame, and that was in Chambersburg when they came down, when he brought Shields Greene down in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, to meet John Brown. And that's when Shields Greene famously said, "I'm going to go with the old man. I'm going to choose to go with John Brown," against Douglass's wishes. So that is how Greene came into the Harper's Ferry circle, how he became involved with him. I believe that Greene was, again, a man with a free background. I believe he had a certain skill set that suggested he was also free. He could do barbering. He could do clothes cleaning. These were jobs that were often associated with free Black people. In Rochester, he took over the proprietorship of a clothes cleaning business. And of course, famously, there's a business card in which he signs it as Shield Emperor. And I believe it's in, July of 1858. So we know he's back in Rochester for a year. And perhaps he came back and he actually missed John Brown. What had happened there was John Brown in 1858 was ready to attack Harper's Ferry, but he was betrayed by one of his men. I've seen someone making a reference to a letter by Quaker Associates. The last name is, I guess it's pronounced Gue, G-U-E. one of these associates heard about John Brown's plans and wrote a letter. That letter came into the hands of federal officials, but it was not regarded. And so there was, in the immediate time, there was an uncertainty about who had written the letter. But the letter itself, providentially or circumstantially, did not have a direct impact. What did have an impact in 1858 was that one man that John Brown had retained, a British man that he had retained to train his men, began to want more and more money. And when he didn't get the money, he threatened, and he went to a Republican senator, and he started to reveal this news. This scared John Brown's supporters in New England, and they talked John Brown, most of them talked John Brown into postponing the raid. And instead, he went out to Kansas in 1858. And so there was no Harper's Ferry raid in 1858 as he had planned. This is probably also what happened with Harriet Tubman, who was all on board with him in 1858. But by the time he came back down, and by the time it was the summer and fall of 1859, Harriet had gone in a different direction. Douglass continued to hold John Brown's hand, but not to support him. In fact, the issue was he didn't really want Douglass to come into the mountains with him. That's a mistaken notion. We know John Brown even told his own family that Douglass had some health concerns. He didn't think Douglass could handle that rough life in the mountains. But what he wanted from Douglass was, he wanted Douglass to stand with him and call Black men to support him. And this is something that Douglass specifically did not do and would not do. And this soured their relationship. I wouldn't say it ended their relationship, but in the end, John Brown considered Frederick Douglass unreliable. And in the end, poor Douglass, I think made the best choice. You know, you have to follow your own heart. I don't condemn Douglass for it, but I do think that in the immediate sense, Douglass did not give the kind of support, did not throw his weight and his name behind Brown. And Brown felt, I think, I wouldn't say he felt betrayed, but I think he felt that his friend did not back him. And so this was a sad note in terms of the story of Brown and Douglass. They had been friends for so long, as I mentioned, family friends and so forth. So that's the story. Now, getting back to Greene, when Greene came with Brown's men, he stayed in Maryland on the Maryland farm that Brown had rented under the name of Isaac Smith with other of Brown's men. This is a number that grew over the summer and into the fall of 1859. It did create interest among some neighbors, curious neighbors who saw a lot of shirts hanging on the clothesline and who were wondering what was really going on. It's very hard to keep secret the presence of all these men. And in fact, they couldn't. Eventually, it slipped out, and some of the men were careless as well. And so there is a strong reason from the evidence, Owen Brown, John Brown's son, and others, that Brown had to move quickly. In October 16th, he led the raid. Greene was in that group. Greene had been there for much of the summer and into the fall, and so was John Brown's 16-year-old daughter, Anne. And Anne is the one who preserves a few lines in describing Shields Greene as a man who had left a baby behind, as a man whose wife had died before he fled. She does not expressly, I think it's the assumption again is that he was enslaved, but I believe that even he was probably, if not literate, he was certainly moving in that direction. I believe he had education sufficient to read. And Brown said that he tried to use big words, but the fact, all the big words that were in the dictionary, and I think that suggests that he probably had some reading ability. So again, I don't view him as either a runaway slave who was illiterate. I view him as a man who fled for political reasons. But I also believe, in closing, that I think Shields Greene was a kind of a freedom fighter. I don't think that he was a hanger-on first to Frederick Douglass and then to John Brown. I don't think he was a young man who was looking to find himself by association with others. I think he was a man with a strong sense of purpose. I think he was a man who was a kind of self-liberated political freedom fighter. And so there's a greater appreciation today, more than in the past, about how Black people themselves liberated themselves, how they participated not as passive figures, but as active figures, how they asserted themselves in different ways to oppose slavery. I think Shields Green was a man of such a nature. He didn't have a big name among his contemporaries, but I believe that he was a kind of a self-made freedom fighter. And I think that he intentionally joined John Brown. I don't think that Frederick Douglass would have gone to get him, given that Frederick Douglass really did not want to support John Brown. So the very fact that Frederick Douglass brings Shields Green to meet John Brown in the summer of 1859 at a stone quarry in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, is more because Green is pushing him, wants to do this, and Douglass is taking him down. And I believe Douglass is actually discouraging him. But all the way to the end, Green says, I'm going to go with the old man. And so he's with John Brown. John Brown fails at Harper's Ferry. My argument would be not strategically, but tactically. In other words, the strategy was to go into Harper's Ferry, gather some enslaved people. The idea that he wanted to rally 1,000 people, that's nonsense. Again, he wanted to rally a smaller group of enslaved men, probably predominantly men, but also women, who would join him and then retreat into the nearby mountains. And the mountains are immediately nearby in Harper's Ferry. Again, he had weapons. He had a small wagon. He had Sharps rifles. He had pikes. Those were the instruments of war that he was going to give to those who followed him. He didn't have any interest in removing the guns. He didn't remove the guns. So again, I want to put a period on that statement, but Green went with him. But he delayed. He went in at about 11 o'clock at night on October 16th, Sunday night, completely took Harper's Ferry, just as he had planned, because he had been studying Harper's Ferry. He'd been studying the armory, he'd been studying the town. There was no military presence there. There was a very slight civilian guard, and they were not even well armed. So he knew that he could easily take Harper's Ferry. He knew that he could occupy Harper's Ferry. And had he stayed in Harper's Ferry, let's say even as late as 6 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning, he could have taken his hostages, and he could have taken gathered whatever group of enslaved people joined him, and he could have made it into the mountains. And so this is something that he could have done, but he delayed. He delayed for a number of reasons that are peculiar to Brown. Number one, I think he delayed because he was very much fixated on legal paperwork. He actually was trying to do paperwork to get slaveholders to sign, to give over enslaved people to do this in exchange for their freedom. This took delays. He said later that they slowed him down with this process. The other issue was he was extremely concerned about the fears and apprehensions of the Virginians. And we know this, we can document this, that he walked a train across the track because the conductor was afraid he was going to blow up the train tracks. And Brown said, my head for this, in other words, I will not do this. I will not kill the people on the train. He let hostages go home in the middle of this situation to see their families because of fear. He took great pains to try to protect the hostages. And Osborne Anderson said later on, he probably should have shown more interest in getting out of Harper's Ferry. So they were captured. They were eventually pinned down. They were brought down by U.S. Marines, and Shields Green was jailed. He was tried. He was tried on the count of aiding and abetting, what was considered by the Southerners to be an insurrection, which again was not. If Brown had wanted to do an insurrection, there would have been a lot of people killed. There was no terrorism involved. There was no insurrection. There was no deliberate intentional attack on slaveholders. It was all the fighting that took place because they were being fired upon, which was true to Brown's code. And Green was also, he was hanged for ostensibly for murder. We don't know if there's any way that they could prove who he actually killed. We know he was an active fighter. He may have shot and killed people, but he was found guilty of murder. And John Brown was hanged on December 2nd. And on December 16th, the same gallows was reconstructed. And 4 Harper's Ferry raiders were hanged, 2 of them black men. The bodies of the black men, John Anthony Copeland and Shields Green, were stolen almost immediately after they were buried on the ground. That was probably intentional. The body, in other words, the Virginians would not have opposed this. The bodies were taken to the Winchester Medical College or medical school. And it just so happened that a white man from Ohio who came to try to get Copeland's body for his family, one of the last scenes he saw was the dead body of Shields Green on the table to be treated as a medical specimen by the students. And there was a measure of spite in this. There probably was a medical, because they could not easily get specimens, but there was a racist spite because black bodies had always been treated in this way, as were some of John Brown's men. And one of John Brown's sons was also taken and used as a medical specimen. And the skin of these men was tanned and used for pouches and these kinds of things. So it's a horrendous kind of a thing. And as I mentioned, he disappears. His body was hastily buried in some farmer's backyard. But in 1882, Shields Green's skull makes an appearance. And there's a noted newspaper article that notes that his skull was on display in Georgia. And in those days, it would have been not like a Rite Aid or drugstore, but it would have been a drugstore. But it was more of a larger venue for artists, for all kinds of business. But his skull was on display. And I close my book by pointing out that this indicates in the 1880s what had happened, that this skull was for the white Southerners, a kind of a memento of a past time when they had power over enslaved people. And what was happening in the 1880s was the undermining of Reconstruction and the return of enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, to a new kind of bondage under Jim Crow. And so, that's the last we see of Shields Green as a kind of an indicator of both the past and also what was happening in the 19th century. And of course, Douglass, who always remembered John Brown and always remembered Shields Green close by. So thank you. I'd be happy to discuss questions. I know I saw some things popping up. I must admit, I'm not using my computer. I decided to use my iPhone, as I told Brandon, but because of that, I'm a little awkward. I've never actually used Zoom on my phone. So forgive me if I'm a little ham-handed in handling this. But Brandon, do you want to mediate questions, or should I try to see? I see things popping up, but I can't seem to control them.
I will happily mediate questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful, illuminating, and in many ways inspirational talk on a truly forgotten, important figure from Rochester's past. So moving on to the questions from the chat. We actually have a couple of comments from Charles Lennart, who is a well-known local historian. He brought up Benjamin Goo in the chat when you were talking about those who may have reported on Brown. He mentions that Goo lived in 1850 at Farmington, Ontario County, with his parents. Benjamin and his brother David were living with the Brown conspirators later and sent 2 letters to the Secretary of War warning of the raid. Goo himself was an anti-war Hicksite Quaker.
That's great. Thank you.
Leonard also brings up the fact that after the raid, John W. Hearn, a former Rochesterian, and brother-in-law Asa Anthony in Rochester, who became a telegraph operator in Philadelphia. What is the odds that an abolitionist telegraph operator would receive the message to local authorities to hold Douglass and be able to stall the message and get abolitionist friends to tell Douglass to get out of town and start his flight to Canada? Hearn needs more local recognition for his connection here and to Douglass before and after, and he's currently seeking to get an article out on Hearn.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I've read a little bit online about Hearn, and yes, it's a wonderful moment in that story, right? Because he made all the difference. And I just want to say, and you know, we were talking about this before, but I really relish and appreciate local historians. And I got to say this, I'm not a well-known historian, but I'm faithful. I'm digging in the trenches on John Brown. I'm not one of these kind of people who goes from one topic to the next. I believe in trying to go deep, but I got to tell you that in that I've always been very much indebted to local history people. Many times they have a better grasp starting in the local context, and then they build outward. I've had this. I was sharing had this experience in Hudson, Ohio. I've had this experience in other places, but seeing Rochester, I appreciate that. I learn, and I can be corrected because of local history. I did a bit in northwestern Pennsylvania some years back, and because John Brown was there in his 20s and learned a lot from local historians. So I appreciate hearing from the local historians. And yeah, it's an amazing fact that there was this sympathy for Douglass. And I think that the story of Frederick Douglass in Rochester must be a fascinating story indeed. But as I mentioned in his autobiography, he kind of claims that he did a lot to change the mood in Rochester. I wonder what you guys think about that. Those of you who know Rochester history, do you think that Douglass was pretty authentic in that claim? Would it have been a different city without Douglass? I suppose, but
I personally would argue yes, but noting who's on this call here, Rose O'Keefe, if you wouldn't mind jumping in, you might be the best person to speak to this. While we wait to see if there's any other comments there, Melinda Wallington asks a question, wondering if Shields Green is mentioned in the Douglass correspondence at U of R. She works there in the Rare Books and Special Collections.
Oh, that'd be interesting. Now, I haven't examined it, and I would tend to think. I mean, I don't know what the period of the correspondence is. I honestly don't know, and I say this with respect. I don't know that Shields Green would have been that important to Douglass at the time. I think that he became more important in retrospect of his determination to join Brown and then dying, of course. But I don't know if contemporaneously he would have felt the need to write about him in specifics. I don't know. Maybe he did, but and certainly other historians have not made that point. Again, I'm not a Douglass historian, but if that's ever found, that would really be dynamite. But I'm not expecting it. Put it that way.
Thank you for that. I see that both Charles and Rose O'Keefe have popped up on my screen as ready to speak, and our discussion about that here.
Yeah, nice. I feel like I'm supposed to say something intelligent. And
sure you will.
As far as, Douglass's presence in Rochester was galvanizing, in that he was considered the spokesperson. And the way I'm always going at it is how I'm always going at it from the family side of things, and that for 25 years the family was here, and that they got to live it while he was coming and going. And I don't envy anybody's life in that time, him on the road experiencing, I'll just say the upside of fame and the downside of traveling and experiencing so much hate.
Yes.
But what you were talking about with Shields Green possibly being free, and how treacherous a life that would have been in the South. It just made me think of the different writings that the kids complained that their mom was so strict. She was so worried for their safety in Rochester. And they were always doing chores and they were working at the office, but that they kept such a strict eye on their children because they had to, because their children were targets. And I just think of what a hard way of life that is, to bring your kids up always being worried for, you know, who's out to get them. Yes. Who hates dad so much that they would take it out on the kids.
Yes.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, that I appreciate you bringing that family point out, and particularly, you know, the wives of these men paid a price in their own way. I'm sure that, you know, again, Douglas's wife did, and her name was Anna. Is that correct? Yeah. And of course, Mary Brown, who throughout this whole story is, you know, at home and dealing with this. And when John Brown, actually, I think part of the reason that John Brown liked to have his family up in the Adirondacks is it really made it hard to reach them. But Mary hated it up there. She hated it. And I can imagine that both wives experienced their own form of feeling oppressed or feeling worried and concerned. But for the Douglases, they're a Black family. So absolutely, this is different. You know, for the Browns, it's a question of, you know, they're hunting for him, but they're not going to do anything to the Brown family the way they would. As you're saying, there is a, you know, that is a particular issue for Black people, just as there is still a concern today for how Black people feel about, and, you know, the experience of how authorities, you know, treat Black people and Black young men. So, you know, these are themes that continue to resonate, but certainly in those days, you don't know. Not only are you not safe as a Black man or woman in the North, but then if you're as you're saying, a point that I think needs to be brought out more, you know, the apprehensions that she must have felt, even for Lewis and the others, you know.
I did a little talk on a talk show about Anna Murray on Thursday, and it'll actually be up probably next week on, it's called the Carla Murphy Show.
Okay.
She records from Buffalo. And Anna Murray Douglass was always caught between a rock and a hard place, because Douglass felt completely that his home, that he could bring into his home whomever he wanted. And Anna was the one who got to deal with managing the home while he comes and goes. He's not having a picnic out there. And some of the people who came into the house with him traveled with him. And when they're in their brick house on Alexander Street, she had to bring in all kinds of boarders just to pay for the place. And she's the one, you know, she was the bookkeeper. She managed all of it, but they had they took in orphan boys. They had white tenants, people staying, paying the rent, and they did not want people. You know, it's a matter of pride. If you're married to one of the most famous people in the country, do you want people to know that you're skimping for rent or groceries, that kind of stuff? They were very deliberate about maintaining a proper public face.
Yes.
But I think Mary Brown probably had it worse. I can't imagine having a large family and being as broke as she was in such a harsh climate.
Yes.
Wouldn't wish that on anybody. But Anna had to keep the act, keep the show running, no matter who was there. And
Yeah.
she certainly liked some people more than others. And then Rosetta is always caught in the middle, trying to help dad and help mom, and always, 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 her entire life, Rosetta was caught between a rock and a hard place,
Yes.
not being able to fully please the one and fully please the other.
Yes.
Ah, tough life
Yeah.
they all had.
Well, you know,
Wow.
that, yeah, that's fascinating. You know, speaking of daughters of Douglass, there is that Anne Brown, who later on became Anne Brown Adams. She sort of propagated, and I don't think, honestly, there was some bad blood, I think, on the part of a lot of the Brown family toward Douglass after the Harper's Ferry raid. I don't think that Brown himself would have advocated that, but I think because they felt, certainly Brown's son-in-law Henry Thompson felt this way, and others did. Annie Brown felt that way too. She claimed that during the Civil War, she attended a speech by Douglass, and that Douglass knew she was in the house, and there was an after party, and that he eluded her. He slipped away. She seemed to feel that there was bad blood. But what I did find was that I've never seen a letter from Frederick Douglass to John Brown's family after this period. There seems to be no correspondence between Douglass and the Browns. I've looked at John Brown Jr.'s papers. I've seen, the collections.
Yeah.
There seems to be no communication. And Annie, one of the things she claimed was that, and I don't think it's true at all, Annie claimed that Shields Green was kind of bribed that if he went with Brown, he would get Douglass's daughter. Yeah, but I just think that it was a ludicrous claim on her part, and so I've had to weigh carefully what Anne said about Shields Green, because she tended to, and this is unfortunately the case, but they tend to reflect the prevailing prejudices of the culture. And in the later 19th century, when she was making these reminiscences, she tended to depreciate Shields Green in certain ways. And she clearly, I tend to think that they're among some of Brown's children, they tend to slid into the thinking of the majority culture. But I think that she tried to depreciate Shields Green. Whereas, I don't think that was the case. Again, I think Shields Green really, he was single. I don't know but I think Rosetta would have been a little younger than he was. How old was Rosetta in 1859? Are you able to?
Not off the top of my head. She was born in, would she have been 20, about 20 then?
About, so 20. So
about 20.
Yeah, so Green was a good decade older than she was. But of course, he may have had a fancy for her, because Anne claimed also that one of the raiders who was with her father in Rochester said that some of the young men who were working in Douglass's newspaper office were laughing about Shields Green, and were making these, kind of laughing. And I take that, I don't know what to make of all that. This is almost gossip in history. So.
Sure. I've only seen one letter, real horrible letter from a white man who was not a great character, offering his services and marrying the daughter for a nice, what's the word, dowry, It was a horrible letter. I think I saw that too. Isn't that terrible? How many times did Douglass get hit on for who knows how many things his entire life?
Yes.
But in defense of Douglass fleeing after Harper's Ferry, and then going to Canada and back over to England, and and then finding out the news that his daughter had died, what the boys have said. Have you seen Celeste Bernier's book of the letters?
No, I'm afraid I haven't.
Oh,
yes.
Come
so
on,
I'd like
Brandon,
to.
you know that book. You know
Yes,
that book. If I survive.
Maybe I could get that information from you, Brandon. So,
I can most certainly send that to you.
okay, thank you.
Okay,
I think
here you go. If I survive, it's got all these letters from the boys. And what they say is that the time before Harper's Ferry was the last time the family was all together. After that, the one boy went out to Lockport. Somebody else was gone. Of course, little Annie dies.
yes.
The whole family was so shattered. And then when Douglas finds out, that his baby girl is gone, I'm speculating, but I can't imagine how you would expect him. I mean, look at the look on his face here. He's pretty grim.
Yeah.
I don't even know what year this particular picture is, but to be in a public setting and see one of John Brown's daughters, I don't know if he could handle it. They lost their dad. He lost his daughter. His whole family was scattered after that. It was such a crushing blow.
You
to
shut
all
up,
of them.
Rose.
Yes. Okay. Well, certainly the outcome of the raid was devastating to the Brown family as well. You can imagine, in fact, and he knew that. I think one of his letters to the family, he said, rebuild the broken walls of our family. And so this is a moment that nobody's ever going to get away from. And I think, Douglass, again, I would say autobiographically, in terms of studying the story of John Brown and that episode with Douglass, I do believe that he conflated the year 1859 into one episode. In fact, he says that the meeting in Chambersburg was 2 weeks before the raid, and it wasn't. It was in the summer. It was in August, and the raid took place in October. But I understand that you do that in autobiography. But I also think there was a pain in Douglass. I think that Douglass, in fact, there's a quote, and I don't have it on the top of my head, from the early 1880s. Douglass actually says, "I loved him. I loved Brown." And I think that if you think about it, that Brown was a little older than Douglass was. Douglass was, as you said, he was a rock star. I mean, he was this guy who was just so endowed with a popularity that was completely unique to him. He was endowed with these immense gifts and abilities. But John Brown was a kind of sage-like figure for him, who, by his own admission, radicalized his discourse. So, by 1858, Douglass's speeches are, I won't even say angry, that would kind of trivialize it, but there's a righteous indignation to how he's speaking in light of what's going on in the nation with the legal doors essentially closing on any hope of emancipation or the end of slavery. And then there's just John Brown character. And I think this is where we need to get past the layers of what shall we say? I will call it propaganda about John Brown. We have to remember that we have seen John Brown and the Harper's Ferry raid through the lens of the Virginians, who are the first people. That they didn't even allow any free state reportage in Virginia after the raid. There was only one man, and I talk about this in my book, Freedom's Dawn, named Ned House, who was an undercover reporter for the New York Daily Tribune. And you have to read the New York Daily Tribune to get a sense of John Brown and what's going on in Virginia. So you have the layer of the Virginians, you have Lincoln and the Republican Party, who, with all due respect, are trying to disavow any connection with the abolitionists in order to make this moderate Republican case in 1860. You have the Mason Report of 1860 that's essentially putting the sympathetic, but again, Republican kind of distance, arm's length distance view of Brown as part of the embedded state record. And then you have, yes, some biographies of Brown, but by the time you get to the 20th century, you have just a number of writings, not to mention movies like Santa Fe Trail and Civil War historians. I always make a joke about, it seems like Civil War historians want to talk about John Brown, but they always drag him through the mud in order to get to Lincoln. And I don't think that as a nation, we really appreciate how important John Brown was in the antebellum era. Obviously, the Civil War came in and blew everything up. Lincoln was assassinated. That elevated him as a figure. But John Brown, all through the Civil War, was a figure of great import to the nation. And after slavery's reconstruction was undermined, the Black community was looking to the memory of John Brown as well. And so you have two histories, almost two historical profiles: the white Northern view, which, well, actually three, the white Northern view of Brown, which is he's heroic, but he's he's kind of a misguided figure. He really was making the way for Lincoln, who was the true hero. You have the Southern view, which was that John Brown was this criminal, was this no good person. And then you have the Black community view, which is John Brown as an ally. And my own argument as a historian is we need to understand the political and social history that helps us to understand how we read history. And I would argue that, first of all, John Brown was not mentally unstable. People are still hanging on to this idea. There isn't any evidence for it. There is no evidence at all that John Brown was mentally unstable. He was a fanatic. But you know what? I think any person that we tend to view as a hero in today's terms is usually fanatical. Anybody who's making an impact in any area that pushes forward for the rest of us to follow is usually a person who's single-minded and tireless. And John Brown was that kind of a man. But there is no basis for his insanity issue. A lot of the details of his biography have to be revisited and reconsidered. I don't know if people know, this is trivial. John Brown was one of the leading experts of fine sheep and wool in the 1840s. His name is written up in journals, agrarian journals of the day. He was considered one of the experts in fine sheep and wool. My point is to say is that they want to present him as a ne'er-do-well. They want to present him as somebody who failed in everything. He didn't fail in everything. He got caught in an economic downturn in the 1830s and 1840s. So again, John Brown is depreciated for a number of reasons. So I think we need to understand who this man was, among other people who likewise were struggling. But, you know, as far as Douglass goes, and as far as Shields Green goes, this was a man that he considered. And I think someone mentioned, what did Douglass say about Brown after the fact? Douglass, I think, does his best to show John Brown in the light of history. And close by is always Shields Green. But to show these men in history, you know, if you read Autobiography of Frederick Douglass and see what he says about Abraham Lincoln, he likes Lincoln. He speaks well of Lincoln as a man, but he tells white people in that book, Lincoln was primarily your president, not ours. He was not really for the Black man. But when he talks about John Brown, he says, when John Brown lifted his arm, the sky was clear. And he ends up saying that in the end, you know, the South are the ones that betrayed the Union. And the lost cause was with the South, not John Brown. John Brown may have failed, but he didn't lose, because John Brown's approach ultimately was even embraced by Lincoln. Lincoln himself had to consider the possibility of using enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, and Black people. He knew he needed them to win the war, and he knew he needed to send them into the South, precisely what Brown wanted to do. So I view Brown as being vindicated in history, but I believe, unfortunately, a lot of the ivory tower scholars are afraid to acknowledge Brown. There's always this tinge of terrorism. And I just want to say one thing about Kansas, and then I'll hand it back. I don't want to eat up all the time, but we hear all the time, every time you hear John Brown discussed by historians, they talk about his life They say it was a business failure. Then they go right to Kansas and they say he killed 5 people. But I want to tell you that John Brown went to Kansas to support his sons. He didn't intend to go there. When he went to Kansas, he was there for 6 months. He never raised a hand toward anybody. He traded and did business with pro-slavery people in Missouri. He said, I'm always very clear about my position, but he never started trouble with anybody. And what was happening in May of 1856 was that local pro-slavery men were working in collaboration with people that I would call pro-slavery terrorists who were invading the territory to interfere with the democratic process by use of violence. And they identified the abolitionist Brown family and were going to attack them. And Brown heard about it. He learned about it. He did his research and he identified the five to seven neighbors, pro-slavery neighbors, who were conspiring to use these people against him, and he killed them. He killed them in the absence of law and order. There was no FBI, no local police. There was no recourse to any protection. And he and a group of men, not by himself, but by a group of men who supported him and did not do this out of being forced to do it. They did this because they understood that if they didn't act preemptively, someone was going to come for them. And if you want to call that terrorism, you're entitled to. But in my opinion, if you look at number one, it was very specific, and I would say it was preemptive. And he didn't live that way before, and he didn't live that way after. So I myself reject the notion of terrorism because, in my estimation, he wasn't doing it so much to start something. He was doing it primarily to protect his family, which is really primarily what he was there in the first place about. He got caught up in fighting because he understood the political ramifications of Kansas. But the so-called massacre, it was a strike, but it was done in the absence of any controlling government. There was no police guiding anyone. There was no federal forces. The government in Washington was pro-slavery. It was turning a blind eye to a lot of the violations that were taking place, and he was concerned about his family. So that's John Brown, as I understand him. For anyone who were thinking, oh, he's skipping over Kansas, I'm not. I'm happy to talk about that, but what I believe is consistently John Brown is a man who is guided by principles. When one of those pro-slavery people murdered his son in the summer of 1856, he absolutely refused the opportunity to get back at that man and to kill him. He had the opportunity to kill the man who murdered his son, and he didn't do it. So I think we have to look at a more nuanced sensibility about this period of time. We have to read history from the ground up instead of reading it from the top down. A lot of our traditional historians, they want to read history through the lens of white leaders in the White House and political leaders. We have to understand the history of the struggling people, the struggling enslaved people who are fighting for their freedom, the white people, that minority of white people who join them and support them. We have to read history in that light. Now, we can meet each other at some point in between because, the political history is necessary. It's necessary for us to appreciate what Lincoln did. But Lincoln was not the great emancipator if you're really prioritizing Black freedom. Douglass says this. I'm not saying this. Douglass says he was not first and foremost our leader. He was your leader, white people. And he liked him. He liked Lincoln. He thought he was a pretty decent guy. But the point is that we tend to read our history through the prerogatives and priorities of what a group of scholars have said on the highest rungs, and they tend to reflect the prerequisites and sensibilities of white society. But John Brown was not that kind of guy. John Brown was a guy who genuinely was an egalitarian by nature. And he wasn't the only one, but there were not that many. And he and Douglass formed a friendship and this friendship lasted for 10 years. And I don't think it ever ended, but I think that it reached a crisis. If they had been able to live, I think they would have worked it out. But I think that in the end, Douglass still valued, and I say, thank God Douglass did not lose his life in 1859, because he is the one who has given us a framework of understanding. Again, I say, read that autobiography, read what he says about Brown. It's very important because I think he gives us a strong framework for thinking about Brown over against the writers of the 20th century, like Robert Penn Warren and others who just really want to malign John Brown and gave that to television, gave that to movies. If somebody, I think, mentioned Good Lord Bird, I think that the Good Lord Bird series is from the standpoint of entertainment, of course, it was entertainment. I like Ethan Hawke. But first of all, why when we tell stories about John Brown, do we use novels as the basis of our stories? I just watched a video about the making of Spielberg's Lincoln, and you would be amazed, or maybe not be amazed, at how much care to detail every actor, every person. It was almost reverential. It was almost religious, the amount of care that went into the historical accuracy of making that movie. But when it comes to John Brown, everyone wants to make a movie based on a novel. And James McBride James McBride definitely does not understand John Brown. He distorts him. He thinks John Brown is crazy. And the novelty is that it's coming from a man who is himself has Black ancestry. His mother, his father's Black. So it seems to provide a novel perspective. But the reality is, what McBride is doing is he created a character and he says, well, it's just fiction because I don't really like historians. But I don't like history, people telling me what to believe. This is things that he says in the interview. But then he writes history because he knows that as an artist, he can do anything he wants. But what he also doesn't seem to realize is that people will take the Good Lord Bird as history. And when Ethan Hawke adapted it to the Showtime series, he made Frederick Douglass look horrible. He made Brown look like he was coming apart at the seams, like he was a loopy man with a good heart. And he made Douglass look like some kind of whining, petulant brat. In my opinion, I think that this series was a terrible place. Please don't start at the Good Lord Bird. I know some people seem to love it, and maybe there's good to come out of it. I'm not the last word on this, not the first or the last word. But my own sense is, if you really want to know about John Brown and Frederick Douglass, you got to look at the history, because that is not where to start. Now, I will say this: I'm working on a project right now. I'm consulting on a project that hopefully it's going to take off, where there are two professional actors who are playing the roles of Brown and Douglass, and they are in conversation. And it's a way to bring present times history into present times. And I think you're going to find there that you're going to get a healthier representation, because I'm working with Margaret Washington, who's a wonderful historian, one of my heroes in history at Cornell, on Douglass, and I'm representing Brown, and we're trying to encourage this discourse, because these are two epic figures. Can you imagine the antebellum era without Frederick Douglass, without John Brown? It's an amazing story. And I'm honored to be able to just, keep digging away at it, excavating what I can. And as I've shared, is that a lot of scholars, they write a biography and then they move on. I call that drive-by biography. Sometimes it's really good, sometimes it's not so good. I have determined to stay and go deep as I can. I've written 4 books plus Shields Green. It's not so much the number of books, and that's not the point about expertise. It's about the study, and it's about digging deep and learning about these people. And that's why I say thank you for doing that work in Rochester. Thank you for caring about Rochester, because, at the end of the day, the historians who are writing these flashy books tend to circle around in the same data and read each other and come to the same conclusions. But it's going to be the people who dig deep and the people who understand the value of local history that really can plug in. I mean, I've learned so much in Hudson and in Meadville, and I'm sure I'm going to learn in Rochester when I can spend some time there. But I see you guys are there. You're doing your job. You're on duty. Keep it up, because you guys are really holding, you guys are holding the light in the darkness. The scholars are going to write these books. With all due respect, they're going to write the book and move on to another topic. But we have to dig in deep. And at least I'm committed to do that. I don't know if everything I've written about Shields Green is correct. I hope we can learn more about him. We need to find out who his parents were, if we can. We need to really confirm whether he was, I believe he was freeborn. I think the evidence suggests that. I may be wrong. So I stated in the book, I say, I do as much as I can with straight lines, and then sometimes the historian has to resort to dotted lines. In other words, sometimes we have to make educated surmises. And so I believe Shields Green was in his 30s. I believe he was a free man who ran away, perhaps with the hope of coming back. I believe he was a radical abolitionist in his own right. And I believe that he had a skill set, that he wasn't this illiterate, kind of benighted figure. I think he was a strong Black man. And one of the things I deal with, and I promise I'll stop, and that is that even looking at the images that have been preserved of Shields Green, most of them are derogatory. They portray him as crestfallen, as defeated, as broken. But I found one sketch in the New York Illustrated News, and the artist who did it, he did a sketch of several raiders in the prison, in the jail cell. And I noticed, and I zoomed in on the image of Shields Green sitting at his bedside with his hand in his coat like this, very regal. And I captured that image. I cut it out, I inflated it, I put it in the book, because to me, this is a guy who liked to call himself emperor. I don't know why. The idea that he was, he descended from African princes. We don't know that. There's no evidence of that at all. But this is a guy who knew that he was an emperor. He knew he was a leader. He saw himself in a certain light. And whatever his shortcomings were, because we all have them, this is a guy, when he poses, he puts his hand in his coat in the manner of early portraiture, because he's striking a pose. That to me is the only real valid picture of Shields Green that has survived. All the other sketches is he's a Black man who's sad, he's got his head down, and this is the way white artists wanted to capture him. So I think we need to reappreciate and retell the stories of these men. These were proud, and I argue, look, I'll take the Harpers Ferry Raiders over the Alamo. Those guys who died at the Alamo, they were all slaveholders, and they all wanted to expand slavery into the South, into the Southwest. That's why they died. I, for one, appreciate the Harpers Ferry Raiders, a group of young white men and Black men following a guy and wanting and hoping to end slavery. I can't find better, more patriotic figures in the history of my country, because they wanted to change this country for the better. And I thank you for the chance to talk. So I promise I'll shut up now. Anything else that anyone wants to say?
Well, we've already gone 20 minutes over our scheduled time.
Okay, so then that's it. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you.
No, if you're willing to take a couple more questions, there are a couple good ones in the chat, but we certainly call it off. So the first one, sorry, I just need to find this again. This is from Marjorie Searle. Terrific talk, and I appreciate your theories about Harper's Ferry. Have you come across anything of interest about Francis Jackson, a New England abolitionist who was purportedly with Brown at Harper's Ferry?
Yes. Now, again, this is a guy that probably needs I need to look more in, because, again, I've not really been a big raider historian. But Francis Jackson, Miriam, he's an interesting figure indeed. He showed up, I think. Now, there's a letter he wrote to John Brown, I believe, and I have it, a copy of it, in December of 1858, in which he wants to join Brown. He shows up relatively late, almost at the last minute, but he brought money. So he had resources. He came from a family that had resources. Again, I don't know enough about him to say, I don't know how much, but I know he was an abolitionist. I know he's a very, very firm abolitionist. He brought, I think, $300 in gold, which John Brown badly needed at the time. In fact, Brown had some of that money in his pocket at the time he was defeated. And then Miriam escaped. He was able to escape because he wasn't in the He wasn't in Harper's Ferry. He was on the Maryland side. He was able to escape. He returned to Boston. I believe later on in his life, he married, if I understand, he married an African-American woman who was a doctor. I don't know whether that marriage ended with her dying or with divorce. I've seen different things and I haven't looked closely. And then I think he died in the Civil War era itself. I don't know what the circumstances were, but he was a passionate anti-slavery man. And again, rule of thumb here is that the guys who followed John Brown were in it. They were in it all the way. They were all in on freedom. I wish I could do better for you, but that's kind of what I know off the top of my head.
Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
Just seeing what other questions we have here. I'm sorry to everyone who's made comments that I'm not going to get a chance to read because we are running out of time. You've already addressed the good Lord Bird. Because it had such an impact locally, I do have to ask if you're familiar at all with a play that was written for a Rochester theater company, Jiva, called The Agitators, which addressed the relationship between Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. Just the person who's asking this asked if Greene was mentioned in that production, but beyond that, I thought it'd be worth asking, do you have any familiarity with it? And if so, what your thoughts might be about its presentation at the time period?
I'm afraid I don't, and I'm sorry that I don't. Certainly like to hear more about it. I know that the only thing I know in terms of, I know that Susan Anthony's brother, I think, was in Kansas and knew John Brown as well. I don't know anything about if there was any other, what other connections there were, but that sounds like a great story. I'm sorry, I don't know.
No, no need to apologize. I just thought I would ask because it had a great impact locally.
Yeah.
And going through it, I believe it's the last actual question that we had in the chat. So
Okay.
Everyone who asked questions, thank you so much, Professor DeCaro, for staying with us for so long over our planned time.
Well, I'm sorry, I ran my mouth, but my wife says if once I start talking about John Brown, it takes an effort to stop me. So maybe I was overbearing, but I thank you for staying. Those of you who were able to stay on, I enjoyed being with you. I wish it was in person, but at least we could connect. Thank you for coming out.
Well, thank you for joining us. It's greatly appreciated. And thank you for everyone who stayed with us for the presentation.
Yes.
Thank you again, and we will see you hopefully next month for our next Rich History. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.